Conversing the Classics, a Classical Youth Society of Ireland podcast dedicated to discussing classics with the subject's experts. My name's Oscar McHale and I'm the founder and chair of CYSI. Today's topic is the supporting troops of the greatest military force ever to exist, the Roman army. We'll be looking at all aspects of Roman auxiliaries, from Caesar's campaigns in Gaul to Trajan's conquering of Dacia. Joining me on today's episode is the soon-to-be Dr. Owen Finn, a PhD student in the UCD School of Classics. Owen, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Oscar. Happy to be here.
Now, Owen, obviously choosing a topic for your PhD is a big decision. Why did you choose non-legionary troops of the Roman army?
Well, basically, for my master's thesis, I worked on Xenophon and his 10,000, which is basically a mercenary army, for anyone who doesn't know. And afterwards, myself and Dr. Philip de Souza, we sat down and we were saying, what will we do next? So I wanted to do something slightly similar. Obviously, I couldn't go much further. Well, I could have gone a little further with the 10,000, but I wanted to change tack a bit. So we decided to look at the Auxilia in the Roman army, which is somewhat similar, but slightly different enough to be, unique or whatever. And so Philip and myself just worked on basically working out a topic and where we could take it.
So what are the main sources that you're using for your thesis?
So I'm using sources from the 1st century AD mostly. So we have Tacitus as the main source. So his Histories, Annals and Agricola. We're also looking at Cassius Dio and Josephus. And then we have smaller sources like Frontinus or Vegetius, but they're not as critical because they're fragmentary. They're not particularly useful, but they need to be looked at anyway.
Yeah. So how reliant was the Roman army from the very late Republic to the end of the 1st century AD on auxiliaries?
I would say very much, because one of the things that people forget is that if you look at the entire military might of the Roman army, at any given time there seems to have been 30 legions. So that is 150,000 troops, 150,000 men, citizens available for service. And you look at the record, there's 300,000 is the total capacity of the army. So half of that is made up of auxiliaries or non-legionary troops.
Wow, so huge chunk. Now, one of my big interests, and I'm adamant that he gets a mention in each of the podcasts, regardless of the topic, is Caesar and his campaigns, particularly at the moment it's Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Now, in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, book 7, Caesar constantly praises the Germanic cavalry he has in his army and their significance in the great military feat that was Alesia. Did Caesar use any other auxiliaries in his armies during both his Gallic and civil wars?
Yeah, he certainly did. I mean, the German cavalry is one of the big ones. German and Gallic cavalry are one of the that he talks about most. Mm-hmm. But he also mentions archers from Crete, slingers from the Balearic Islands, and those sort of cavalry and the archers and slingers are the main guys that he would mention, specifically by name or by the type of soldiers that they are. He does mention other allied troops, and that's an important thing to remember, that at Caesar's time, we're not entirely sure whether the Auxilia, as they are in the 1st century AD, has developed as a concept yet. So it seems that these guys are more allied troops who are enlisted as, say, the chief of the tribe has to send soldiers to fight in the Roman army, to fight for Caesar. Yeah. But the Auxilia is slightly different in that they are a formally enrolled fighting force under the Roman army, like the legions. Yeah. Which is a difference that seems to come in around 42 AD under Claudius, when we get the first military diploma of an auxiliary soldier. Yeah. So it's hard to say when they became auxiliaries before that. And
were the auxiliaries, when they enrolled in the army, treated with the same manner of respect as the Roman legionaries were, with regards, obviously, their pay, their living conditions, I suppose their rations and stuff like that? Were they given the equal rights, or were they a step down, or a few steps down even?
Well, the important thing to remember there is that they're not citizens, so they're not going to get the same deal that the legions get. They got half of the pay that a legionary would get, but obviously in terms of provisions they would have to be somewhat similar, because it's a fighting force. You need to provision a fighting force regardless of whether it's, what status it is. Yeah. But the legions are sort of the golden boys of the empire, whereas the non-legionary troops are not considered as, not important, but they're not given as much praise, as it were, as the legions are in the sources.
And like with regards their actual training, when they signed up, were the auxiliaries given the same training with the wicker swords and shields and the long marches with large amounts of equipment on their back, or was it specific to what kind of an auxiliary they were, or was it the exact same?
Again, it's hard to say with certainty what their training consisted of.
Yeah.
Presumably, when they enlisted, they would already have a certain amount of experience at military, maneuvers or whatever, or they'd be proficient with weapons, because when you're signing up from a tribe, you probably had to have had some sort of training in fighting to protect your tribe or whatever. So again, physically what they actually did for their training, it's probably similar to what the legions did, but again, it's quite hard to say with any certainty. I mean, Tacitus talks about the guys who enlist. Some of them already have experience, because he talks about, at one point, there's a rebellion in Thrace, and the way the Romans dealt with it was they took the most warlike men from Thrace and enlisted them in the Auxilia. So then the most warlike are taken away, they can't cause trouble.
So was that forced recruitment, or was that forced recruitment, sorry?
That was, in essence, forced recruitment.
So they didn't get a choice, they were told, pack your bags.
Yep, and so Thrace was a client kingdom at that stage.
Yeah.
So the king was having trouble with these tribes, and he called in the Romans to say, look, can you sort this out for me? I've always been loyal, whatever. So the Romans just enlist the most warlike guys into the army, so they're not causing trouble in Thrace anymore, basically.
Was it possible before, obviously after you served your 25-year period as an auxiliary, you got your citizenship, but before they got to that point, was it possible for an auxiliary to be raised from just a basic auxiliary troop to sort of a higher rank, like an optio or a centurion, or possibly even something higher, obviously before they were given citizenship?
Generally, I would say probably not. They can rise to a certain height in the auxiliary system, but auxiliary troops are generally commanded by a junior Roman officer. So a guy like a tribune or some guy on that level would be sent to command an auxiliary unit. That would be part of his cursus honorum, going up the ranks. Start off with the auxilia and then maybe move up to a legionary cohort or whatever. On the other side, other non-legionary troops, guys who aren't necessarily from provinces, so they're from allied kingdoms, they command their own units. So we see them rising to command the unit. People like Arminius, as we'll see later, or a guy called Cariovalda, who's the chief of the Batavians. But within the auxiliary system, it seems that command is for Romans more than for the auxilia themselves.
Now obviously today's focus is on auxiliaries, but were there any other sort of tag-alongs in the Roman army on top of those just serving as auxiliaries?
We very often see, particularly in Tacitus, we see, and this is where the distinction comes between legionary, auxiliary and others. So which is why I'm looking at non-legionary troops rather than auxiliaries. Sometimes we see camp followers are armed.
And where would the camp followers be recruited from? What sort of background? Would they be Romans? Would they be, again, just sort of people from provinces conquered by the Romans?
Yeah, they could sometimes be slaves. They're basically the people in the baggage train of the army. They carry all the equipment, they drive
would they be doing things like the cooking and the cleaning?
Cleaning, possibly. Soldiers generally did their own cooking, and the legionaries carried their own tent and their equipment, but the larger equipment would be carried by the camp followers, and like any army, you always have probably the same number of people again following it. But yeah, so that's one type that we see sometimes, not very often, but sometimes we do. Another one is gladiators, which people might find interesting. Gladiators are somewhat unique in that they're not soldiers, but they do turn up, certainly in Tacitus, they turn up on the battlefield. Obviously gladiators are slaves. They're nowhere near citizenship. They have no real rights at all in the army. But the interesting thing about them is that when they turn up on the battlefield, it's generally in the armies of people who are not considered as particularly moral, for want of a better phrase. So people like Vitellius in 69 AD, he fields gladiators quite a lot. Otto in the same year fields in the civil wars. So generally when we see them, it's a damning of the general, as in look at him, he is resorted to fielding gladiators. What is he like? That sort of thing.
In other words, that he's resorted to using slaves. He's using the lowest of the low.
Exactly. So yeah, we do see other kind of guys coming in, and there's one passage in Tacitus where he's talking about a battle. It's in the histories, so I think it's Otto against Vitellius. And at one point, he talks about the two lines coming together, and mixed in among I think it's the Vitellian soldiers, are a load of peasants, and the peasants are just throwing stones at the enemy. So you get the sense that they've just turned up, they've picked up stones and started throwing them. But again, that could be the same sort of thing. Look at him, he's just got peasants in his line throwing stones. So again, it could be more about damning the leader than these things actually happening, but it's possible.
And I wanted to sort of understand the mentality behind the common auxiliary. Like, your country would have just been conquered, your freedom's been taken away from you by the Romans. Why would you bother? What would the appeal be to sign up to become an auxiliary within the legions? The Roman legions, of course.
Well, I suppose if you've just been conquered, you're not going to be particularly laudatory of the Romans. You're going to think, wait, hang on, what is this? But eventually you would probably come to realise that you're getting paid a regular wage. It's better than scratching a living off the dirt like you might have been doing in your tribal system. Yeah, so there are incentives, and generally the Romans didn't obliterate cultures. They assimilated cultures rather than wiping it out.
They had and I think that's part of the reason, I mean, going off on a bit of a tangent here, it's part of the reason why I would imagine that they were so successful, as opposed to once they conquered someone, they didn't necessarily kill them and wipe them out. They sort of made them their friends. That would be one of my reasons for thinking why they were so successful and lasted for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, when you conquer a land, it's better to
have the natives on side.
Exactly, they work for you, they pay tribute, they'll contribute soldiers to the army then if you treat them properly. And the Romans frequently let conquered people keep their own religions, keep their own beliefs. They maybe conjoined that with Roman religion, so you find sort of strange Gallic versions of Roman gods in Gaul, say, for example, and things like that happening.
But not only that, I mean, I'm interested in the language side of it, that by sort of the late 2nd century and 3rd century, the Romans have stopped using the word equus for horse and have started using the word caballus, which is the Gallic for horse. So it seems as though it worked both ways, probably to a lesser extent the Romans taking stuff, but they definitely did take stuff from the tribes they conquered, which I think was quite important.
Definitely.
And I suppose it's a bit links in with the auxiliaries. You know, they took certain battle tactics from those auxiliaries.
Yeah, that comes up again and again. Like when you're fighting, say, a rebel, which we'll see in a while, if he's in Africa, then obviously it makes sense to use local troops rather than heavily armed legionaries to fight him. They know what they're doing. But yeah, it's all part of, say, the Romanization process. You assimilate people and then eventually they will become Roman, I guess.
So getting a bit more back on course, by the time you reach the mid to late 1st century AD, the Roman Empire is expanding rapidly. How did the role of auxiliaries change in that time, and sort of what significance did that have on the expanse of the empire?
I'm not too sure if the role changes too much, but certainly the enrollment has changed. So they're now officially being enrolled in auxiliary units. They're being paid half the wage of a legionary. They're granted citizenship on discharge, all that stuff. But unlike in the 1st century BC, they're not sort of just drafted in as allies. They're actually formally enrolled. And again, as it's expanding, you generally find the legions on the frontiers, because that's where all the action is. You do see auxiliaries there as well, but in the interior, garrisons are very often are auxiliary troops from somewhere else who are brought in, because the area is already pacified. You don't need much of a legionary presence. So the garrison duty is
do you also think that that's sort of the divide, that the legionaries are just there to fight and kill and subdue the tribes, and then they're sort of above the idea of policing it, and so it's left to the auxiliaries, or so the auxiliaries sort of take on a role of almost policemen? Or
to a certain extent. We certainly see that in some of the garrison towns in the provinces. There's also guys called vigiles who are effectively policemen. They're
watchmen,
sort of
isn't it?
Town watch. They act as everything from policemen to firemen, all that sort of stuff. Again,
although they're not meant to be much good. There's a story that when Rome catches fire under Emperor Nero, they take part in the looting as opposed to stop trying to put out the fires.
Yeah, I mean, anything goes under Nero, it seems.
How long after conquering province or country would the Romans start enrolling auxilia?
As soon as the province is relatively pacified, I would suggest.
a decade, or obviously it would vary depending on, but it would be somewhere in and around 10 years, I would imagine.
And also you have the situation where in that province or that country there are different tribes. They're all related, but there's different tribes, some of whom will ally themselves with the Romans against their own personal enemies. So then they'd be more than happy to contribute troops.
Yeah.
Or, well, not necessarily more than happy, but they would be more willing to contribute troops than the guys they're fighting against themselves, because the tribal system was always fighting against each other. So I mean, I suppose however long it takes to pacify the country, then they'll start recruiting auxilia.
So who are the most renowned auxiliaries and the most liked to have in your army, sort of the most prestigious to have in your army during the period of the 1st century AD?
Generally, German and Gallic cavalry seem to be the main guys that we see, or the most sort of trusted. There's a group called the Batavians from modern day in the Netherlands, sort of Belgium, the Netherlands area. It said they came from an island in the Rhine. And they're, for Tacitus anyway, they're generally held to be of like among the best. As I mentioned them earlier on, Cariovalda was a Batavian chieftain who, under Tiberius and Germanicus, he fought with Germanicus the campaigns in Germany.
In Germany.
They're generally considered to be the best. Tacitus sees them as, he portrays them as having the honour and the value systems that the old republic used to have, and that they're held
Tacitus
up
is,
as,
of course, a huge fan of the old republic.
And he holds Germanicus himself up as like a republican hero, as David Levine has mentioned in an article. He holds Germanicus up as a republican hero stuck in this twisted imperial system, and to a certain extent the Batavians are the same. They exhibit the old sense of Roman honour. That's certainly that's
lacking
in 69 anyway.
Tiberius,
and later on in the civil wars of 69, all the Roman honour is gone, and the Batavians keep it maintained. They exemplify that.
So with regards the place of auxiliaries in the legion, did each Roman cohort have a certain number of auxiliaries within it, or were there specific cohorts dedicated to auxiliaries, or were there even legions entirely made out of auxiliaries?
So we see they have their own structure, which is almost the same as the legion. So obviously they have a century of 80 men, and then they have a cohort, which is 6 centuries, so that's 480 men, and that's known as a quingenary cohort. Quingenary meaning 500. And then so there's nothing larger than that. So it goes to cohort, but there's no auxiliary legion, for want of a phrase. It's it just stays with cohorts, and you get however many numbers of cohorts needed sent wherever.
And are there any particularly famous individual auxiliaries renowned for their skills on the battlefield, or are there any famous Roman figures who started out as auxiliaries and then worked their way up?
Generally, we only get the names of commanders. It's very rare. I can't think of any examples of ordinary soldiers, but people like Arminius, who we'll come to in a sec, and Tacfarinas, or again this Cariovalda guy, they're all chieftains, so they're going to be leading their tribes for the Roman army. But again, it's hard to say afterwards if they became famous once they got their citizenship, because if they get citizenship, they generally take a Roman name. So then they can very often, unless they use their original tribal name as well, they can sometimes disappear from the record, or they're very hard to trace in the record.
And obviously you mentioned there Arminius. In 9 AD, a group of German auxilia led by Arminius lured the army of Varus into an ambush in the famous Teutoburg forest, and it's a very famous battle and one of sort of the great defeats of the Romans, which is seen as a surprise to everyone because you always see the Romans as these undefeatables, but they really tear chunks out of them. Are there any other examples of auxiliaries rebelling and having great success against how the Romans fight?
Yeah, definitely. This is an example of where, in the last question, famous individuals, they're generally villains, which is unfortunate for them. So obviously Arminius.
I don't think they saw themselves as villains necessarily, but to the Romans they were.
So we have Arminius, obviously, as you mentioned, but another one we have Tacfarinas in North Africa. He was a Numidian chieftain who basically he felt he was getting a raw deal from the Romans and his people were getting a raw deal, and he decided to rebel. And he rebelled in the late teens, so around 16, 17 AD to about 22, 23. And it took 3 Roman armies to get rid of him.
It was of huge danger, and it's surprising that they didn't prepare for this beforehand, knowing the Roman past successes. Usually Romans are very well, they're seen as being very well prepared, but it's unusual that they allowed these people to join their army who could betray them at any minute, but they allowed them to join the army, learn how the Romans fought, learn how they were successful. It's sort of inevitable that big defeats like Teutoburg Forest and Tacfarinas' rebellions were so successful that, why didn't they think ahead to this?
Well, I guess because if you look at how they eventually defeated Tacfarinas, so the first general they send out, he goes out with, I think it's 3 legions and some auxiliary troops.
Yeah.
He does win, he defeats Tacfarinas, but Tacfarinas himself escapes, so it's not over. He comes back again later on. He raises another army, and his tactics are basically guerrilla warfare to ambush the Roman army. And in North Africa, a Roman army kitted out in full gear is very heavy.
It wouldn't have been plate mail, it would have been chain mail at that time. But yeah, it would have been very, because chain mail is actually heavier than plate mail, so it would have been, it would have been roasting. On top of that, you've got your helmet with the padding. It would have been it wouldn't have been an easy task moving around desert in that sort of gear
and fighting against horsemen, predominantly horsemen
who were used to the climate,
used to fighting in that sort of style. So then the Romans, the second army they send out against him, probably slightly better prepared, but again they defeat him, but he escapes. And then the third one they send out later on under Dolabella is composed almost entirely of non-legionary troops, local non-legionary troops. So they know the terrain, they know how to fight these guys, and they eventually capture him, they corner him, and they kill him.
And with regards tactics, what kind of tactics did guerrilla warfare, but I mean specifically on the battlefield, what sort of tactics did Tacfarinas employ?
Basically hit and run tactics.
So similar to that of the Parthians at Carrhae in the late Republican.
So all the usuals, hit and run tactics, scorched earth tactics, where you just destroy everything.
And especially in desert, that would have been devastating. And I suppose then to follow up on that, once the auxiliaries got hold of how the Romans fought, it would have been very easy. Like you see there, Arminius had a very, very effective tactic in that he led them into thick forests so they couldn't form up into their lines. The Roman scutum, their shield, was completely useless in hand-to-hand combat because it's very weighty and unwieldy in that situation when you're not aligned. Their sword is short and not much good unless you are in a shield wall. It seems sort of odd that the Romans didn't prepare and think, hold on, if these guys learn our tactics, it's only a matter of time before they use them against us.
And one of the ultimate example of that is if you look at some of the Eastern kings, say the kings of Pontus or whatever. They have experience of service in the Roman army as allied kings, and when some of them rebel, they start to arm their own guys like legionaries, exactly the same. They wear the armor, the helmets, the swords, the shields. They're obviously not as good. They don't have the
training and the training,
but they learn from their time in the Roman army.
And would a commander of an auxiliary cohort, let's say, or century even, be of Roman birth, or would he be another higher ranking auxiliary? So, would the centurions or the Optios be Romans, or would they be from the tribe or people that the auxiliaries were recruited from?
Generally, they seem to have been junior Roman officers. It's possible that you may have had somebody elevated to a rank sort of like a centurion from the auxiliary unit themselves. But the overall commander of the cohort seems to have generally been sort of a low-ranking tribune who was working his own way up in the Roman ranks to say legion commander or whatever. So they tend to be Romans rather than barbarians, for want of a better word.
And in your opinion, obviously, are auxilia given enough credit in Roman writing, considering the work they did for the empire, or have they been slightly pushed aside because they're not Romans?
I think that depends on who you're reading. So and what that writer is trying to do. So, for example, Tacitus at times, he's very, very complimentary of the auxilia and the non-legionary troops. In his Agricola, he talks about the Battle of Mons Graupius, where he mentions that, it was the auxilia were sent out to fight. The legions stayed back and said, look, if you need us, we're here. But the whole battle was fought by the non-legionary troops. And we see examples of that sort of thing again and again. But there are other times, for example, when Tacitus is talking about something that needs to be done, needs some battle or some engagement that needs to be fought, that is the legions can't be seen to be doing, because the legions are held up as the honourable, and, you know, fighting for Rome is the best thing you can do. And he talks about in Germany, Germanicus is fighting against German tribes, and Tacitus talks about how the Germans are big, you know, drinkers and festival goers, and they tend to...
So sorry, this is, again, we're sort of going off completely up point. Do you think that Tacitus's writings of saying that they're big into their drink is just sort of to lesser them in compared to the Romans, who are, well, it's not true, but who would be very moderate in their drink, etc. But do you think that that's slightly made up, or were they actually all raving alcoholics?
Well, it's hard to say, but I mean, it's mentioned in other sources. I'd say Pliny mentions it in his Lost History. Tacitus mentions it in the Germania as well. But it seems to have been a barbarian thing that they did enjoy.
They liked it. Well, I mean, the Romans did as well, but they wouldn't like to admit to it.
But as I was saying, if we go to the Germans and their drinking festival, Germanicus's troops come across this festival of Germans, and the Germans are all passed out drunk, and they're asleep, not even prepared. They're not armed at all. And he sends the non-legionary troops in, because attacking unarmed men is not what a legionary should be doing. So it's the non-legionary troops he sends in to sort of kill them in the dark and sneak around.
So, but I mean, is that a reoccurring thing, that the auxiliaries were given the dirty work and the things that the Romans weren't to do? Or do you think the Romans may actually have done this, and Tacitus didn't want to sort of lesser the standings of the Roman troops' honour, and that sort of rubbish, really, that sort of propaganda?
I mean, it's hard to say whether they would have done this or not. They probably did.
They probably did.
So,
I mean, so do you think that they were often given sort of the dirty work, the sort of the less honourable? I put that in quotation marks, but
I guess in the sources it certainly seems that way. But I would argue that the legions probably did the same sort of thing as well. I mean, we hear of how legions plunder cities, and it's not exactly, you know,
it's
not
of set things on fire and rape and
pillage and plunder and burn. So I think they are given the credit. Well, not enough credit, but they are given more credit than modern scholars seem to think that they are. In the source, like if you read the sources closely, you can see that they do actually a lot more than.
So they were liked.
I don't know about liked, but they do a lot more than modern scholarship seems to think they did, and that's because, and the image that we have of them as being less than the legions is because they're not legions, obviously. So So in summary, coming up to the end, what are the 3 most important facts that you would like our listeners to take from this podcast about auxiliaries? Well, I guess one thing is that to remember that they are unofficially enrolled in a system like the legions. It's separate from the legions, but they are officially enrolled. That's the one thing to remember. Second thing is that, you know, they're definitely not cannon fodder as people tend to think that they are. They have a much more important much more important contribution to the army, and then on that, again, remembering that they composed half of the military power of the Roman army, so that's quite significant, I think.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Owen, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge on auxiliaries with us. I'd like to wish you the very best of luck with the rest of your thesis, and indeed the rest of your career in the classics. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more or get involved with Classical Youth Society of Ireland, you can contact us via any of our social media pages on www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland. Or if Facebook isn't your thing, you can follow us on Twitter @CYSI_. For any direct inquiries, you can always email us, cysiofficial@gmail.com. Today's podcast was produced by myself and edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.